Do you have an intermediate level of English? Do you feel like you're stuck at that level and you just can't take the next step? Do you dream about finally becoming fluent and speaking English confidently? If so, this is the video for you. I'm going to tell you 10 super tips in order to take your English from an intermediate level to an advanced level. So, let's get started. Welcome to English with Lewis. Let's go! Number 1, read extensively and diversely. We cannot underestimate the importance of reading. And when I say reading, I mean reading everything. Novels, poetry, news articles. Basically, the more you read, the more vocabulary you will start to learn, and then you can incorporate that vocabulary into your speech. I have to be honest that this is one of the things I'm guilty of, that it's much harder to read a book than it is to watch a series. However, when you do read a book, you're going to learn so much more vocabulary. An example is that I have read The Lord of the Rings, the whole trilogy, in Spanish. And at the beginning, I was lost. There were so many adjectives and different phrases and idioms and expressions, but bit by bit, little by little, you'll start to familiarize yourself with these words and phrases and then remember them later. So reading, I know it can be complicated, but you need to give it a go and read a wide variety of different content. And at the same time, take some notes and test yourself after reading to see if you can remember some of the new words and phrases. That's number 1. Number 2, focus on advanced grammar. At this stage, I'm sure you're very familiar with the differences between the past simple, the present perfect, going to, and will. This, I think you've already passed that phase. So now you need to try your hand at using inversions. Had I learnt the inversion sooner, I would have improved my English. And not only inversions, but the third conditional and other advanced structures. So if you feel like your grammar isn't quite good enough, you need to do some research and search for advanced English grammatical phrases. And then the more you read them and hear them, you can start to use them in your speech. This, again, it's maybe not the easiest thing to do because you have to read explanations and practice with different gap fills and exercises. But when you use a structure like the more you study, the more advanced you speak, you're really going to show off and impress the other person. So, advanced grammar. Give it a go. Number 3 is to engage in active listening. And I always preach listening to podcasts, listening to the radio, of course watching series at the same time. And with series, you can do it in original version with subtitles in English, and that's fantastic. You can take notes for new vocabulary at the same time. But I find that when I'm really focusing on what I'm listening, it's when I'm listening to a podcast and I'm going for a walk. And my mind is solely focused on what I am listening to. So this is what I mean by active listening. The opposite scenario is if you're on your laptop doing some work and you have the radio on in the background here, you're not really going to take in the information and it's going to go in one ear and out the other. So if normally you go for a walk or you go to the gym or you do the washing up or any housework at home, put some earphones in and then try to engage with what you're listening to and ask yourself some questions at the same time to really focus on the information. And I recommend using headphones with noise cancellation technology. That way you won't be distracted by other noises. That's our 3rd tip. Number 4 is to immerse yourself in an English speaking environment. Now, if you move abroad or you travel to the UK, to the United States, to Australia, you're probably going to do this, but sometimes immigrants, expats, people who move abroad, sometimes they avoid actually immersing themselves in the language and they start hanging out with people from their country or the language that they speak. So this is something to avoid, to really throw yourself in at the deep end and go outside your comfort zone to try to do everything in English. These can be passive things like listening to podcasts, watching series, reading the news, but if you have a hobby, try to do your hobby in English. Maybe you like playing paddle. Join a paddle club with English speakers. This, of course, it's easier said than done, but you can use applications to meet up with people. You can try messaging Facebook groups to see if there are any English speakers in your city. You can also have a language exchange with someone else, or you can take classes with a teacher, and that way you can try spend as much time as possible every single day in English, and you'll notice that you start thinking in English. You won't be able to avoid English, and that is the goal. Number 5 is to develop a rich vocabulary and use it. So how can we do this? Well, of course, we can immerse ourselves in the language and read as much as possible. But here's where all of these videos on YouTube and Instagram come into play. But many people, when they watch my videos teaching phrasal verbs and idioms, they might swipe away, or they'll watch it, but then again, they won't take notes or they won't use the words after. So here you have to be aware and conscious and engaged with the content to take notes after you've read a book or watched a video, and then try to use it in your next conversation. Another way of doing this is, of course, by writing a journal, writing a diary, but basically you want to be learning new vocabulary every single day and keeping a log, maybe a little notebook, to test yourself on the vocabulary and quiz yourself on the new vocabulary that you're using, because we need repetition in order to learn. So you need to repeat the words 3, 4, 5, 10 times before it goes into your long-term memory. And that's when you'll be able to retrieve the words at the right moment in your next business English meeting or presentation or little chit-chat with your friends. Number 6 is to practice speaking daily, every single day. You need to be speaking English on a daily basis. And ideally, you would be doing this with friends, going out on dates, for example, with your colleagues at work, with possible clients also at work. The more we speak, of course, the better you are going to speak. It's not rocket science, of course, but what can we do if you don't have the privilege and the ability to practice with other English speakers? Again, we can go back to the fact of finding a teacher or a conversation exchange, or joining some kind of English club, doing an activity, a hobby in English as well, going to a bar or a club and trying to make English friends. But if you do not do this, then, or maybe if you're an introvert and you're a bit shy and you feel a bit apprehensive and nervous about speaking to people in English, well, you can speak to yourself. I know, it sounds ridiculous, but when you go for a walk, you can start speaking out loud. And maybe people will look at you in a funny way, but who cares, you know? I don't care. I don't give a monkeys. And I'm sure they don't either. But nowadays, we also have artificial intelligence, AI, and then this internet age, we can use robots to help us. So with ChatGPT, you can have a conversation with ChatGPT and record messages, and then the robot can respond to your messages. And you can also ask ChatGPT to correct any phrases that you use. So that's one way to do it. The other is to look in a mirror and kind of act and pretend that you're speaking to another native English speaker. But you have many options. Of course, we need to try, because if not, you'll regret not trying to find English-speaking friends. So make an effort, and if not, speak to robots. Number 7 is to write regularly and ideally get feedback on your writing. So we can write a journal, a diary, as I mentioned. We can also write emails too, and there are loads of useful apps and websites and technologies that can help you with this. One famous one is Grammarly, that you can start writing things in Grammarly, whether that's an email or a story or you name it. And then you can ask Grammarly to correct your writing. Sometimes we don't even need to use Grammarly. We can just start writing on Google, and then it will automatically give you suggestions to correct your mistakes. Now, with these artificial intelligence ways of giving you feedback, it might not be ideal all the time. You might not always have an in-depth explanation, but it's much easier and much cheaper than getting a teacher to correct your writing. So, of course, I am a teacher, but I think writing is something that we can do independently, and then you can get enough feedback from the internet. With speaking, perhaps it's harder, but with writing, this is something that you can do in your free time. You can say, all right, at the end of a day, 30 minutes, I'm gonna write an email about what I've done today, or I'm gonna write a journal, or anything like this. But the important thing is to be thinking about writing, and then that will test you to see if you can remember and recall all of this new vocabulary. So get writing. Number 8 is to master pronunciation and intonation. Again, this one's quite hard to actually put into practice, but the number one technique we can use in order to do this and really improve your pronunciation is shadowing. Now, what is shadowing, you ask? Well, shadowing is the act of watching or listening to native English speakers speak, in our case, and then pausing the clip or pausing the podcast and try to repeat word for word with the same intonation and the same pronunciation what they said. So maybe I'll be on my laptop, I'm watching a YouTube video, and then after every 10 seconds, I will pause and try to repeat what they said, how they said it. So it takes a lot of work, but it's fun at the same time because you're watching content, which is always amusing and entertaining, if you ask me. But the best way to improve your pronunciation is always going to be this technique, shadowing. And basically, it's just trying to imitate and copy other ways of speaking, other accents. And I'd recommend that you pick one accent, maybe an typical RP accent from the south of England, or if you're working on your American English, choose a series that you like and an actor that you think, ooh, I like the way he speaks, and then really try to copy it to the last minimal nuance and detail. So that, number 8, is shadowing. Number 9, the penultimate one, is to learn to think in English and maybe even dream in English, which again is much easier said than done. It's hard to actually master this ability, and it might not ever happen to you all of the time. But in my case, when I am surrounded by Spanish and I spend a lot of time with my family-in-law and they're speaking Spanish all the time, I find that I start to think more in Spanish than I do in English. And there are other scenarios where words like vamos will come to mind instead of let's go. So we can only do this if we immerse ourselves in the language. We need to spend as much time with the language as possible. And then again, when you're thinking about anything and you are conscious that you're thinking in your mother tongue, in your first language, see if you can switch it to English. So maybe I'm going for a walk and I'm thinking about what I'm going to do to celebrate my birthday, and I'm thinking about it in English, then I would switch it and try to start thinking about it in Spanish. And it's another great way to test your memory and realize what holes you have in your vocabulary. Because then you can think, okay, I'm going to buy a cake and I'm going to the candles. What's the verb? I'm going to blow out the candles. And you're only going to know this and learn these words and phrases by pushing yourself to think in English as much as possible. Finally, number 10 is to challenge yourself with tricky advanced topics. What do I mean by this? Well, it's very easy for many of us to speak about our hobbies, to speak about food maybe, to speak about sport even, but it's very difficult to speak about DIY, tools, technology, and law, and paperwork. So all of these advanced topics, which for many native speakers, it's difficult to know specific words and specific slang, but this is really a sign of being 100% fluent in a language, is if you can have these difficult conversations using very specific vocabulary. And the only way we can try to improve this vocabulary is to start consuming content related to it. If it's law, for example, you'd start watching a series about law, listening to a podcast about law, and reading articles about law. And then when you come across new words and phrases, you would look them up online or in a dictionary, and then little by little, you'd start to know them and learn them off by heart. So this is the most complicated thing, because I must admit, to tell you the truth, I would be lost having a legal conversation in Spanish. And my Spanish is pretty much fluent, but there are still little areas that I need to work on. And that's normal. It's part of the process. At the end of the day, if you are studying a language, you have to know that you're going to be doing it practically for the rest of your life. Because if you don't use it to a certain degree, you do lose it. So learning a language is a lifelong journey, so it needs to be enjoyable. And with all of these 10 tips, the only way that you're going to be successful with them is if you find what works for you. I've been giving my tips, but of course you need to adjust and adapt how each tip works best for you. And then you'll find the key to finally becoming fluent and being confident in English. So, fingers crossed, I wish you well, and if you have any questions for me, any doubts about these pieces of advice, then don't hesitate to leave me a comment and I'd be more than happy to reply. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and see you next time.